Let's read in Matthew chapter 12, please. Matthew chapter 12 is where the Lord Jesus encounters the man with the withered or the shriveled hand. So let's just pick up that story at verse number 13. Matthew 12, verse 13 to 21. Then he told the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and it was restored as good as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted against him how they might kill him. Jesus was aware of this and withdrew. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them all. He warned them not to make him known, so that what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. "Here is my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not argue or shout, and no one will hear his voice in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed, and he will not put out a smoldering wick. Until he has led justice to victory, the nations will put their hope in his name." Matthew lays out his material to draw a significant contrast once again between the Pharisees and the Lord Jesus. The Lord has compassion on a man and he heals him, and the cruel, callous, heartless, self-seeking, self-promoting, self-righteous Pharisees, the violent Pharisees, respond by plotting to kill him. And then the Lord Jesus, he's aware of this, and he doesn't call down lightning to strike them. He withdraws from the scene, and he heals more people. And God says, "This is my servant." Not those cold-hearted, violent, self-seeking Pharisees. "Here is my servant, whom I have chosen." Now, it's a lovely title, my servant. It's a dignified title because this is God that is speaking. And he says, "This is my servant. I've chosen him. He's my beloved, in whom I delight." But it's also a title that shows us the lowliness of the Lord Jesus. He is a servant. And this is coming on the heels of the end of chapter 11, where the Lord Jesus has described his own character. I think it's the one time he describes his character, and he describes himself as meek and humble. He can say that. It wouldn't be too, it would be a bit odd for you to say, if I was to meet you and say, "What kind of person are you? You know, what do you like?" Well, I'm a very humble person myself. Oh, good to know. But the Lord Jesus can say that in sincerity and honesty, and he backs it up right here. And so the quotation that Matthew grabs from Isaiah is meant to emphasize this contrast again and to show the gentleness of the Lord Jesus in contrast to the Pharisees. I think Matthew gives us 10 Old Testament quotations, regularly using this phrase, "that it might be fulfilled," so that it might be fulfilled. The most common one that he quotes from is Isaiah, as he does here. And of the 10, this is the longest of his quotations, as he quotes from Isaiah chapter 42, one of the so-called servant songs. And he says, "This is so that the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled." That's what the Lord Jesus did with the Old Testament scriptures. He fulfilled them. The Old Testament scriptures were like a container, and he poured himself into them and filled them to the full, showed himself as the substance of Old Testament prophecy. "Here is my servant, my beloved, in whom I delight. I have put my spirit on him." We're speaking a little bit about the spiritual disciplines, and we said that spiritual disciplines are practices that the Spirit of God will use to shape us, to train us, and empower us. Well, the Lord Jesus knew more of that than anybody. He received the Spirit of God without measure. He's led by the Spirit, always empowered by the Spirit, and in the energy of the Spirit, he displays perfect self-control. Perfect servant. And yet when crowds are flocking around him in John chapter 6, is it, and they're ready to make him king, that's the very time that the Lord Jesus withdraws. And here, as he heals multitudes, he warns them not to make him known. That's then the impetus to bring this quotation from Isaiah, and it says he will not argue or shout, or no one will hear his voice in the streets. It's not that the Lord Jesus never raised his voice. He did at times. It's not that the Lord Jesus never had a word of rebuke for the Pharisees. Of course he did at times. But the point is, the Lord Jesus was not self-promoting. The Lord Jesus was not someone that you would call a loudmouth. And when people are in awe of his healing power and the potential of his ministry, the Lord Jesus displays this perfect fruit of the Spirit, and he retreats. He will not argue or shout, or no one will hear his voice in the streets. He is a gentle person, in contrast to the loudmouth, self-seeking, self-promoting Pharisees. Well, I want to focus on verse 20 and this aspect of the Lord's ministry. He will not break a bruised reed, and he will not put out a smoldering wick. Reeds are plants that grow in the thousands, the millions in wetlands and marshes. And they had a variety of purposes: musical instruments, measuring sticks, and writing instruments. Reeds had a great variety of uses, and they were in abundance. One thing you didn't want was it wouldn't be much good. It was already a fragile plant, so if it was bruised or broken, that would be of no value to you. And because they were so cheap, a dime a dozen, there were so many of them, so easily accessible, if you had a bruised reed, you would just crunch it up, throw it away, and go get another one. Because they were so easy to access. You didn't need to worry about a single bruised one. Just throw it away. That's not how the Lord Jesus approaches people, though. And I'm wondering if there is a bruised reed here this morning. And you've come to this conference weekend and you feel like your spiritual life has been a little bit shattered. Maybe you've been bruised by the world. Maybe you're bruised by your own choices. Maybe you're bruised by how others have mistreated you. Maybe you're just bruised by life. Life's just throwing some stuff at you, as it does sometimes. And you feel a bit shattered and weak and fragile. Well, that's great, because the Lord Jesus specializes in dealing with bruised reeds. He will not break a bruised reed. I think of a man that I met at a conference once who had been through some tough stuff in life, and he had gained some special insight, I would say, through all that he had been through. And as he shared with me some of his perspectives and what he had learned of the Lord's dealings, this was fantastic. I said, you should write some of this. We should get some of this published in Truth and Tidings. He said, no, not me. Nobody's going to want to hear from me. I'm damaged goods, man. I'm damaged goods. I felt kind of bad. We're all damaged goods. Maybe you feel particularly damaged. Well, the Lord still wants to hear from you. The Lord is not going to discard you and say, well, there's a whole bunch of other people here I can use, so I don't need you. Well, the Lord doesn't need any of us, but the Lord wants to use each of us. A bruised reed he will not break. So if you come feeling a bit mistreated, feeling bruised by the world, whatever it is, recognize that the Lord Jesus is patient and gentle and lowly with you. He will not put out a smoldering wick. Well, the wick is this braided group of fibers, flax, whatever, that will burn the oil or the wax. You get this bright flame on the wick, but if it's not trimmed properly, or if it's just not working well, then it's smoldering. It's worse than a disappointment. It's a nuisance, because not only is it not burning brightly, but it's producing smoke. So it's a nuisance. And if we had a smoldering wick, we would snuff it out, throw it away, and get another one. The Lord Jesus doesn't put out a smoldering wick. And maybe you used to be burning pretty brightly, and now you feel like there's just the occasional puff of smoke, and the flame's not very bright. I wonder what you think the Lord thinks of that. Do you think the Lord Jesus stands there in heaven and sort of another disappointment that I'm just gonna, another one for my pile that I keep over here of discarded disciples? Now, the Lord doesn't have a pile of discarded disciples. And he tends the smoldering wick. And he is able to make you burn brightly again. He wants to patiently disciple you. Who do you want to be discipled by? You want to be discipled by the Lord Jesus. He's gentle and lowly. He is lowly and humble. So you can come to him and find rest for your souls. You can come to him afresh. Find rest and take his yoke upon you. You could do that this weekend. You could do that this morning. You could say, Lord, I want to know your yoke upon me again. I want to be led by you again. I want to know your burden that you say is light, because I feel burdened by my own sin and my own failures and my own disappointments. And I want to experience you as my true master again. I think it was Jason that quoted Peter's words from Luke 5 when Peter said, "Depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." You know how the Lord responded to that? You know what his next thing he said was? Don't be afraid. Because that would be our impulse. I'm a sinful man. He wants nothing to do with me. As he now has seen me for who I really am, he wants nothing to do with me. Don't be afraid. Peter, I'm going to use you, you sinful man. I'm going to use you. He didn't call him sinful man. Peter said that. The Lord does not break the bruised reed. He doesn't put out the smoldering wick. He calls him to himself and bids him follow him again. So that's the Lord Jesus. That's his grace towards you. And I would love you to fall in love afresh with him again and stick near him and know that he sticks near you, and enjoy his blessings.